I'm Paul Sullivan, your host on the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, strange, and silly aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men often feel they have to hide, or at least not talk about their parenting roles. I know this from firsthand experience as a lead dad to my 3 girls, 3 dogs, 3 cats, and somewhat shockingly, 3 fish who are still alive. I did this all while managing my career, striving to be an above average husband and supporting my wife in her professional aspirations. One thing I know for sure about being a lead dad is it's not a normal role. You're not doing what dads have traditionally done, going to work and leaving the parenting role to mom or someone else. Nor are you always welcome in the world where moms are the primary caregivers. But here at the Company of Dads, our goal is to shake all that off and focus on what really matters: family, friendship, finance, and fun. Today, my guest is Kristen Shockley, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Georgia. I reached out to her after reading a story in the New York Times that discussed her research on pandemic parenting. Her results, depending on your general demeanor, were either strangely shocking or completely depressing. I'm an optimistic guy, so I went with option A. More on the results later. Welcome, Dr. Shockley, to the Company of Dads podcast. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, Professor, you're down there at the University of Georgia, so I can't start off any podcast without asking you this question. If I were to buy tickets to any sporting event at the University of Georgia that was not a football game, what would be the best option for me to see? You
got to see the Gym Dogs, gymnastics team.
I love it. I didn't even know this. The Gym Dogs.
Yeah, they in the past decade they've been quite good, and they sell out in the Coliseum. So people are really into it. It's really cool to see a female sport get that attention. Yeah.
That's wonderful. But I have to ask: does the Bulldog go into the gymnastics arena?
I have not seen Uga at the gymnastics arena, I have to say. You know, he lives in Savannah, so he lives about 5 hours away. So
I've read about him. He's got like his own like vehicle that drives him around, and
he does,
climate controlled.
Yeah, they did this new faculty tour for faculty when they first started at UJ. So a couple years ago when I started, I did it. And they surprised us at the end, and Uga was there. And it was like, a celebrity sighting. His car was there, and yeah, he's very well taken care of.
Do you have like an autograph, like his paw on something like that?
But I do have a picture of myself with him, and I might have like the biggest smile I've ever had in my life on. So.
Oh man, that's wonderful. So let's kind of pivot back to your research. You know, I recently read about the study that you conducted during the early part of the pandemic. It was published last November. So I'm guessing you're doing the research just as things sort of started, as people sort of went to the work from home model, or many people who could went to the work from home model. Can you just sort of talk for the listeners, just kind of summarize some of the key findings from that research, your sort of the hypothesis that you went in with, and then what you found during the research?
Yeah, so I'll also give you a little bit of background on how the study came to be. So it was early March, right when everything started becoming real in the U.S. and things started shutting down. And at that time, my son, whose birthday is today, he's turning 3. But at that time, he was 15 months. And we got the news our daycare was shutting down. You know, at that point, it was supposed to be just 2 weeks. And I started sort of panicking, thinking, oh, okay. How are we going to manage this? My husband is a chief technology officer of a startup company, so he works pretty long hours, doesn't have that much flexibility. And then I started thinking, well, if I'm worried about this, there sure are a whole lot of other people in the country that are in the same boat. How are people going to manage when we still have to work? A lot of people still have to work, like you said, but we're shifting to remote work. But the vast majority of the childcare, daycare centers were closed, and a lot of people didn't feel comfortable having, nannies come into their house. So we very quickly launched a study, and we surveyed dual earner couples, so both people were working and had to keep working at this point, who had at least one child under age 6. And we wanted to focus on people with young kids because they're just a little bit more demanding from the childcare perspective. And so we got the surveys out, like I said, I think it was like March 20th, asked them, what are your plans for dealing with childcare, this upcoming time? How are you going to have to adjust your work schedule? How will your spouse? We asked, and they were all heterosexual couples. We asked the wife and the husband. And then we content coded that to see sort of what people were saying. And then 2 months later, we'd originally planned to follow up after the pandemic was over. We all know that's kind of a joke, right? We still are in it. So we decided 2 months later, things, people probably were in a bit of a routine. And then we assessed some well-being. So in terms like psychological distress, sleep, family functioning, in terms of relationship tension, family cohesion, and then job performance. And going into it, we're really interested in, did people use gendered strategies? So is this falling mostly on women, or are we seeing kind of more egalitarian type divisions of labor?
Yep.
And the part you're talking about, the shocking or depressing part, was the biggest. So then we did some kind of complex analyses, sort of content coded that data and kind of came up with these groupings. And the biggest group we had, which was 22% of our data, was called the wife remote and doing it all. So these were couples where,
and that's not something you want on a coffee mug, I'm guessing.
No, I don't think. Well, I could tell you it wasn't great in terms of outcomes for that group. So these couples were, just like the name implies, the wife was remote, the husband sometimes was, sometimes wasn't, but she was doing pretty much all of the childcare. And you saw, not surprisingly, those people had the highest relationship tension, reported the lowest family cohesion. They didn't have the lowest sleep, had low psychological or highest psychological distress, and also were not performing very well. So
it doesn't surprise me that they didn't have the lowest sleep, because they're probably exhausted and then
just passed right out. And what I thought was interesting, thinking about this from the dad's perspective, I would have thought if you were in that couple, then and you were the husband, your job performance would have been fine because you weren't really changing anything. But actually, that was not the group that had the best job performance. And I think that speaks to the issue of, if one person is taking on all this labor, it's creating this tension in the relationship, and that's spilling over into the husband's work life too, even if he isn't actually doing the childcare. So if we take like a step back and think about it from an organizational standpoint, like, it's not great to just not offer flexibility for people, because it may ultimately result in them performing worse, because you're having them, then they have to put it on someone else in their household.
Right. I want to go back and unpack this, because as sort of, the people who go to the Company of Dads who listen to this podcast know I've got 3 daughters, and they're now 12, 9, and 4. But when the pandemic started, they were 2, 7, and 10. And I remember the beginning of it well. Everything else is a blur because it's just been the same. But in the beginning, the 2 older ones, I got them gathered around the dining room table. We finally had a use for the dining room table beyond Thanksgiving dinner. And they were there with their laptops. I was there with my laptop. My wife was there with her laptop, or in a different room if she had to make a call. The most challenging one, of course, was the 2-year-old, because her nursery school tried to do, remote, but you can't do remote with the 2-year-old. But one of the things that struck me is that in your research, you found that the roles didn't really change, that the moms are still doing more. And I kept wondering, like, what were the dads doing? Because back then, like, I wasn't doing any, like, my wife and I weren't doing anything. Like, we weren't going out. Like, we didn't like suddenly say, want to go out to lunch? Everything was closed. Where I live, like, it was cold. I couldn't go play golf. I wasn't doing anything, outdoors. I live in Connecticut. And I think, like, my day essentially consisted of, every day was exactly the same. I was, working, helping my kids with Zoom, and then, more or less around 5 o'clock, mixing a margarita for my wife and me. So what when you were, I don't know if you were able to drill down on this, but, why didn't the roles become, more equal, or what were the dads doing with all that extra time if they weren't, knocking the cover off the ball with their jobs?
Yeah, I don't know. We didn't specifically ask that. I can say from some of the open-ended descriptions, some of these people were in couples where their spouse was a first responder or was in healthcare. Sure. So, those people, like, still really had to go into work. So that could have been part of it, but that's not all of it, because some of these husbands were remote. Some some people talked about, he's trying to help, but the kids just sort of prefer mom, or maybe he just kind of wasn't stepping up in the way that he needed to. Other people seem to suggest, and I don't have data to speak to this, but my hunch is that during the pandemic, companies were, because of these gender roles in society, more accommodating to moms than dads. So I think in some cases it might have been easier for the moms to say, like, look, I have to deal with kids, and the company was more understanding. And maybe the dads didn't feel comfortable doing that, or maybe the companies were less open because they were like, well, what's your wife doing? That kind of thing.
That's interesting.
Probably multifaceted, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that, right. I don't want to simplify what was nuanced research, but I mean, is it fair to say that the companies bore some responsibility for this, at least in the beginning, when they were just expected, well, okay, you've always come to work every day, so why can't you just keep working at home?
I think absolutely. I mean, if you take a step back and look at what people have had, particularly with kids, have had to endure during this time, I mean, it's pretty wild. Like, a lot of people's work expectations did not change at all. And there was no childcare available, at least for me, for like 6 months. It's a really long time. And that's why we're seeing huge levels of burnout, I think, is because people just, and a lot of people are back in daycares now, but it's still not 100%, the same. And there's a lot of, I can speak from my own experience with my kids in daycare, there's still a lot of times when it shuts down because of potential exposures. And so we're still juggling a lot. And I don't think there has been as much accommodation as one would have hoped.
Mm-hmm. When I first read about your research in the New York Times, there was this quote that you had in there, and I just want to read it because it was really striking, and it kind of touches on this corporate angle that we're talking about here. And it says, part of the issue is because it's entrenched in so many different things. There are so many different pieces that would have to move for things to really change. And this, of course, quotes referring to the parenting dynamic of, it's still falling primarily on the mom, even if, let's, for argument's sake, the two parents have equal careers. What would have to move? This is an area of research for you. What would have to change? Like, what would start that change for there to be, more equality, or at least, and we're going to get down to the different categories in a minute, but at least for that dad who's doing 5% to get him up to 25% or 35%, if not a full 50%.
Yeah. So I think part of it starts from when the kids are born. When you look at the data on the average amount of leave people have in the U.S., across the board, it's pretty terrible. But it's the last time I checked for dads, the average was 1 day. 1 day of leave after kids.
That's the average. So I didn't do terribly well in statistics in graduate school or just really math in general. But if the average is 1 day, and if I took 4 weeks off when my last was born, so I'm skewing the average. So I mean, can you have less than one? Can you have like
a lot of people have none.
Negative 1 day? Like, how do you?
I mean, a lot of people actually have nothing.
But I don't want to joke about this. Are these people who are just not given the opportunity to take the leave, or are these people who have the opportunity to take the parenting leave as the dad and choose not to, or feel that they can't take it?
Yeah, so that's a really good distinction. So this is the amount that they take. So I think you're seeing both of that with people who just don't have access to it. If they do, it's unpaid, and a lot of people just can't afford to go without getting paid, especially right when you have the expense of a new baby. But in a lot of places, there just is no leave for dads, period. And so I guess you could take sick leave, but again, it's really making it difficult for people to be able to take the leave they need. So if we start out with a system that's imbalanced, research shows from the get-go that imbalance, is going to carry over. When you look at families where dads do take longer leave in the beginning, you tend to see a more equal division of labor later on. So that's one issue and I think part of that is we don't have really any government support helping in that sense. We have pretty much the weakest. I think there's 2 other nations that have no guaranteed paid leave in the world, and we're amongst them. So, it's putting it on companies to sort of do the right thing, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. So
I wanted I'm so interested in this. So I'm just going to interrupt you
Sure.
because I want to know more. When you look at, the correlation between that amount of paid or amount of sort of parental leave, paid or not, parental leave that dads take, and the more they take, the more involved they are later on. I mean, do you have any sense if that greater leave in the beginning sort of primes the dad brain to want to be more involved? Or do you think the dad who would decide to take additional leave is just wired to want to share more of the parenting or want to be more involved with the day-to-day with his kids?
Yeah, I think it's probably both. It would be great to be able to do a true experiment where we randomly assign people to take leave and then we could parse it out. But I did just read an article, and I can't remember where, but it was fascinating about, they had done some stuff on the effects of taking leave on the dad's brain early on. And they showed that some different connections were made from dads who had that initial bonding period when they had more time off from work. So I do think there is something that's going on that goes beyond the just selection effects.
I don't want to make light of anything, but I'm thinking back to my own time being super involved with my 3 daughters when they were really little, and I just wondered what was going through my brain because I was so sleep deprived. I started joking, and then it wasn't a joke anymore. That I just try to get the balance between coffee, water, and red wine correct. And if I could do that, I'd just keep sailing. But too much coffee, you're jittery. Too much red wine, well, obviously you're hungover. And then too much water, you got to go to the bathroom at the wrong time. All of which makes it very difficult as a demanding child. This is all right. So we've got the early stages, and I know. Look, paid parent leave is a huge issue right now in America. Mm-hmm. I know it's important, but as a father with sort of almost 13 years under my belt, I think sometimes like, okay, that's the beginning, and it's not easy. It's a lot of sleep deprivation. In my late 40s, I wouldn't want to go back to it for any money in the world. But kids don't get sick at the opportune time. Kids don't fall at the opportune time. Kids fall and get sick or just need to talk when you have something to do for work, when you have a deadline, when you have a project that's due, when you have your boss calling. Do you have any ideas as to how to make things, better for those parents so there can be more equality, or even, in the case of what I'm trying to do with the company of dads, for lead dads to sort of emerge and proudly, take on more of that parenting responsibility? Are there things that the government, that companies can do, that society can do to normalize somebody putting their hand up and say, look, I'm not going to lie to you and say I'm sick. I'm not going to lie to you and say I got to do this. I got to help my kid, and I got to help my kid for the next 3 hours, and then I'll log back on.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you use the term normalize, because I think that's another part of this multifaceted issue, is that it is normalized for women to say more, hey, I have a sick kid, but it's not normalized in the same way for men. And so that's where, in that article I was talking about, the author was asking me, do you think these things are going to change? And I was just sort of pessimistic because, how do you change this ingrained sort of masculinity in society where, it's not okay for men to admit that they're doing something for their family? I mean, I don't even know if that's masculinity, but this idea that it's not the man's role to do something for their family, which I think a lot of us on the surface can say we accept, but when you look at behaviors, they don't always align with that. So I think the way is for men like you and your listeners to step up and talk about it. And so that then other people see, okay, it's okay to talk about it. He's talking about it and he's doing fine. Because I think a lot of it, and there's some research that supports this idea, men are doing this stuff silently, whereas women aren't. And so then that's just perpetuating the problem, because if you're doing it silently, nobody knows the reason behind it. If you were talking more about it and being outward, then I think that would get us there to helping normalize it. But again, that's like a slow change, and it's not like a super easy action-oriented item.
Yeah, no, and that's what we're trying to supercharge here. Because there's a flip side to it. It's like, when you're not telling the truth, you're causing a lot of harm. So men may be doing it silently and not being vocal about it because they don't feel comfortable. And look, I was guilty of that, for almost all of my time at the New York Times, because I thought, okay, I can, manage everything around here. But I didn't feel super comfortable telling my guy friends in my town in Connecticut, the running joke is like, I'd be sort of, after a round of golf, look at my phone, am I really going to blurt out, do you have any idea how hard it is to get a 4-year-old into a ballet class? I mean, they look at me like I'd had 14 drinks on the golf course.
Yeah.
But the flip side of this is they're often, senior female executives, at least, as my wife, who's a working mom, tells me, who appear like they're doing everything and they're managing everything, and they're not really saying like, okay, I have a nanny, or I have 2 nannies, I have, a couple nannies and a housekeeper, or I have a husband who's at home and doesn't work. I mean, I know that may be out of the purview of your research, but I mean, is there just a broader case for parents, whatever they're doing, being, bluntly honest with the roles that they're having in the hope of normalizing it a bit more?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think it's all on men. I agree there. If everybody talks about it, particularly women who are higher up in the organizations, I think that can have a trickle-down effect. And that's also a good thing just from a role modeling standpoint, so people know you really can't do this all by yourself. It's actually impossible when we go back to that ideal worker idea, right? Like that whole mentality of being totally committed to your job was based on the notion that you had somebody at home doing everything else. It is actually impossible to do both of these things perfectly without tons of support. And I think we just need to be okay with that and talking about it and focusing more on, well, what does that support look like? And from the work side, we're still doing work in this old way. Like, what can we do now that's different that helps with support? And I think that's been one cool thing for the pandemic is this remote work shift. Now companies, there was a huge hesitation before for remote work, which a lot of parents wanted just for the additional flexibility, saying, well, you can't do this job. It couldn't be done remotely. Well, now it's pretty hard to say that when somebody's been doing it for 18 months, right? And so I'm kind of excited from that standpoint. I think we're going to actually see a real change in a rare sort of circumstance where we got pushed into it with remote work becoming more the norm, which I think can help generally with some of these issues too, in terms of support for everyone.
Yeah, you said something there, and you and I were talking about this before we started the pod, and that was the notion of the ideal worker. And this kind of goes back to Milton Friedman, famous economist at the University of Chicago. The business of business is business is his famous phrase. But of course, when that notion of the ideal worker came about, people went to work and they worked a certain number of hours and they went home. Maybe they were doing shift work. Maybe they worked 9 to 5, 9 to 6. And when they went home, they didn't have a cell phone. They didn't have a computer. They didn't have people calling them. And I wonder if, yet we still cling to this idea of the ideal worker. I mean, is it I think I'm going to answer my own question here, but it feels like it's time to just put to rest that notion of the ideal worker because work is so fungible. Many of us, not all of us, but those of us who can work remotely can sort of work whenever we need to, and that's both good and bad. Because if I would think my own situation in the pandemic, I was able to sort of say, okay, I'm going to take an hour and do this with one of my daughters, and I justified it to myself by saying, well, if I was on a phone call with somebody right now, and my boss is trying to reach me, well, she wouldn't be able to reach me because I'm on a phone call doing work. So what's the difference if I'm, spending this hour with my daughter doing what either I want to do with her or she needs to do with her? But I think I still, that I had to come up with a strategy like that to justify taking an hour away. Whereas, if I was in back-to-back meetings and she was calling and I didn't answer the phone, I wouldn't really worry.
It's just really interesting in the way work has historically been structured. And then we haven't, like you're saying, we haven't shifted it with the changes in technology. It's actually kind of crazy that we even still work 48-hour, most people more than 40-hour work weeks based on the increases in efficiency we've had. And it really stems, if you look at the origins of the 40-hour work week, it's came up in a very different time than today. So it should just be do what you need to do, right? Like, there's this idea of a results-only work environment, which I think is really cool, and there have been studies that show the benefits of this, but it's just get done what you need to get done, when you need to get done it, and that's it. So if you want to do something with your kids in the middle of the day and work later at night, like, fine, it's like the accountability factor is there. Why do you need to physically be, I mean, for some jobs, of course, you do need to be physically there, but why, for a lot of jobs, you need to be physically in the same place from these set hours, taking up like most of your waking hours? Like,
yeah. We'll move on for this. I could talk about this forever, but I do think of myself like a history major in college and graduate school. And I always like to remind people like the 40-hour work week, it was instituted at a time when people retired when they were 62 and died about 64. So it was kind of structured in a completely different era, and now yet we still cling to it. One of the things I like to talk about from your research is you talked, about a couple of these personas or archetypes that you found among the sort of father-mother relationships and how they split up the childcare duties and the household duties during the beginning of the pandemic. I'd like you to talk about some of the other ones. You talked about wife remote and does it all, but there's wife remote doing most, alternating days. There are all these different strategies that people came up with to sort of make it work for them. And it'd be great if you kind of highlight the significant ones and then sort of explain to the listeners why those worked or didn't really work.
Sure. Yeah, so we had the wife remote and does it all. Then we had the wife remote and does most. And what I found fascinating about this group, so the only difference was these people would say like, I'm doing all childcare except for Thursday afternoons my husband takes the kids, or if I have a big meeting he'll step in. And we saw a lot of negative outcomes like I talked about before with the wife remote and does it all, but we did not see that same trend with the does most, except for
why do you think
lower
it is?
Sleep. I'm not sure. I think there could be something about there's other research that suggests that gratitude plays a really big role in couple dynamics, and so I think if you're in that situation and you're recognizing I'm doing a lot of the childcare and maybe it's because function of our jobs, it just works better this way, but my husband's trying to step in when he can, like that takes away a little bit of that resentment and that tension to some extent. That would be my hypothesis. I don't know. We couldn't really parse that out with the data, but I thought that was really fascinating that just having a little bit of relief seemed to go a long way.
Meaning like I have a couple big calls later the week at 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, whatever. Can you rearrange your schedule to do that? And that's when the wife remote doing most, when the husband kind of came in. Is that how the scenario worked? Yeah.
Exactly. Or they would just have like a set afternoon that he, that was his one afternoon to watch the kids. But yeah, it was a mix of those two things. So that was interesting. And then we had a couple egalitarian strategies. So those two were those skewed towards traditional gender roles. And the egalitarian strategies tended to be, the first one was alternating days. So these were people who were largely not remote. And so, one might work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the other Thursday, Friday. And we actually saw some pretty positive comparatively outcomes for those couples. And I think that's because there's something to being able to totally segment your day. Like today right. I'm on with work, today I'm on with kids. And
that makes sense to me because it's like you're not being interrupted when you're trying to work. And so you're just totally locked in, you're working. And then when you're not, like, okay, here I am doing Zoom school.
Exactly. But by virtue of that, you have to reduce your hours. And a lot of people don't
have to be hyper organized too. You have to be hyper organized if you're going to be trading off like that.
Yeah. And you have to have a job that would allow you like, oh, you're only working Monday and Tuesday. I think some people were probably doing that without telling their company. But, a lot of people couldn't have gotten away with that. So I think that only worked for certain types of jobs. Then we had two other egalitarian strategies, and they both were where both people were remote. But in one, we called it the planned mini shifts. So these people would just, every day it was like the wife's working, let's say, 7 to noon, and the husband's working noon to 5. And they would just have their mini shifts each day. And then we had the second was remote.
That one there kind of resonated with me because what my wife and I did was I would sort of, it'd be in the morning when the kids are doing their Zoom school and I'd be at the table and she'd be doing any calls that she has, as many as she could where she needed privacy. And I don't know, answer emails to do whatever and kind of, watch over the kids. And then we flip it. And then in the afternoon, as they were finishing up school or doing whatever, she'd kind of step in and I'd go do the, 3 or 4 calls that I couldn't be disturbed for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw, it was a good chunk of it was a little, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think maybe 15-ish% of the people were doing that strategy.
But just for full disclosure on that strategy with us, the margarita making at 5 o'clock, that always fell to me.
That's an important part of the strategy there. Totally agree.
Kept us going.
I got pregnant with my second baby during the pandemic, and my biggest concern was like, how am I going to give up the 5 o'clock drink? But I did it. So then the other strategy with the 2 remote people we called it needs-based alternation. So these people didn't have those many shifts. They would a lot of them said, each night we sit down, we look at our schedule, and we decide who's going to be with the kids when, based on what we have to do that day, and also based on the kids' needs. And ahead of time, I would have thought, that seems pretty challenging to me. That seems like a lot of work and a lot of communication. So I would have thought that would have been not as good for well-being outcomes. But actually, we saw better outcomes for that alternation strategy than the mini shifts. So the mini shifts, people were performing worse, and they also had a little bit more relationship tension. And
meaning because like somebody might run over on their mini shift and then cut into the other person's mini shift, or
yeah, I'm not sure if it exactly why. I mean, it could just be perhaps because it was rigid too, and you just didn't feel like you had as much wiggle room. I also think that needs-based alternation required you to communicate, and we know that communication in general within a couple is good for a lot of things. So it may just have been sort of a byproduct of that they had to communicate in order to do that strategy. But I was sort of surprised by that finding. But yeah, across the board, the alternation based on needs seemed to be better.
Yeah. One of your findings, and you mentioned this earlier on in the pod, but that wife remote doing most was the best outcome for relationships. You could expand on that a bit, but I'd also like to know, was there one strategy that was the best outcome for both, some sort of balance between both the relationship and the sort of work productivity?
Yeah, that alternating days one.
The alternating days one. That was
like,
the best
if you
one
looked across the board, yeah, that seemed to be the best. Even though they were reducing hours, those people still said they were performing pretty well. And it was self-report performance, so maybe it'd be different if you asked their supervisor.
Where the hell has Bob been? I mean, he hasn't been here at Tuesday in like a month and a half. What's he doing?
He's like, I'm doing great.
He was making the margarita at lunchtime, so he was doing fantastic.
Yeah, but that seemed to be. But again, I think that only works for a certain type of job. So I think you kind of have to look at, okay, what realistically can you do, and within that, I would probably advocate for the needs-based alternation if you're both able to be remote. If one person really can't do anything, then I would say try to make it so they can step in a little bit and get that wife remote and doing most. So although hopefully it's not just wife, just somebody remote and doing most. And I didn't talk about this at all. There was a small percentage, I think it was 4% of the data, where the husband was doing most or all, but that was only 4% of the couples.
That makes me feel elite that I was in the 4%.
Yeah. Good job.
But you also talked about this, and this is another interesting point, that the wife remote does it all. That hurt the husband's job performance. And you would think sort of intuitively, well, why? If any, he doesn't have any sort of commute. He's not driving to work. He's not sitting on a train. He's has all those hours back in his day. He should be super employee, but he suffered. And why? Why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, I have to think it goes back to the relationship tension, because we saw that group had the highest tension. And that's from, both wives and husbands were reporting high tension. So it wasn't just like the wife was annoyed and he was oblivious. I mean,
and he was taking a nap.
Yeah, they're both
using those extra hours to nap.
Yeah, they're both picking up on like things are tense right now. And I think it's just hard when things are tense at home. It's hard to focus at work. And there's probably some guilt that came along with it. We didn't really measure any of these like resentment, guilt emotions, but I have to think that a lot of that was going on. That was just distracting from being able to be 100% at work.
Mm-hmm. Professor, this has been great. I'm just going to start wrapping things up here, but I really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, your findings, I know you talked about sort of revisiting this, at some point, I guess you said at the end of the pandemic. So
who knows when?
Talk to you again in a couple of years. But I hope you do revisit this, because I'd love to see if anything stuck, if people, did they learn from their mistakes? Did they learn that what I'm doing is not making anybody happy, or do they just persist? And what my question though is, when you look at this data, and it's probably not your role to be prescriptive, but if you looked at this data and you could sort of advise, fathers and mothers on how to sort of, interact, react going forward, what would that advice be? Like, what does this data show you? What should we have learned from this to be better parents, husbands, wives, workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would advise, don't just sort of default to what maybe seems like the path of least resistance, which I think, because of a lot of the way things are, that I've talked about before, ingrained in society, is going to default to the mom being the one that picks up most of the childcare. I would say really sit down and think about, what can we do here that's going to make this a little bit more equitable? Because even though we found some good outcomes for the wife does most, that was pretty short term. I think long term people can't sustain this kind of thing. And so, whether that's strategizing about how can you talk to your boss to let them know, like I have to have some flexibility here. I can't just put this all on my spouse. Whether it's thinking about creative ways that you can pick up the slack, maybe shifting your schedules a little bit. I think it's really important to just push things and think outside the boundaries versus default to maybe what feels like the simplest path, because society sort of puts that on the mom typically.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you again for joining me, Professor, on the Company of Dads podcast. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, thanks for having me, and go dogs.
And listeners, please remember, we're all in this together.